This will be chapter 17 of Pride and Prejudice. In chapter 16 of Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Wickham spills the tea and tells us a lot of information. He mentions that Mr. Darcy is supposed to marry his cousin, who is actually Lady Catherine de Bourgh's daughter. Lady Catherine de Bourgh is Mr. Collins' patroness. He also mentions this pretty scandalous past, which explains why in previous chapters one of them went white, the other one went red when they ran into each other, that Mr. Darcy's father, Mr. Darcy Sr., was supposed to set Wickham up with a profession and a job. Wickham Sr. and Darcy Sr. were really good friends, but Mr. Darcy was very jealous of Wickham and essentially stopped him from getting his rightful inheritance. So that was chapter 16. Chapter 17. Elizabeth related to Jane the next day what had passed between Mr. Wickham and herself. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. She knew not how to believe that Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard. And yet it was not in her nature to question the veracity of a young man of such amiable appearance as Wickham. The possibility of his having really endured such unkindness was enough to interest all her tender feelings, and nothing therefore remained to be done but to think well of them both, and to defend the conduct of each, and throw into the account of accident or mistake whatever could not be otherwise explained. So we know that Jane is a very kind soul. This is a very clear example of that. She learns of everything from Elizabeth, and she can't seem to justify Mr. Bingley being friends with Mr. Darcy in light of all of that, and she can't believe that someone would treat someone else so poorly. So she thinks that there must be some sort of misunderstanding or accident or mistake, that most likely Wickham isn't to blame and Darcy isn't to blame either, but that's a very Jane Bennet positive view of everyone, way to look at it. They have both, said she, been deceived, I dare say, in some way or other, of which we can form no idea. Interested people have perhaps misrepresented each to the other. It is, in short, impossible for us to conjecture the causes or circumstances which may have alienated them without actual blame on either side. Very true indeed. And now, my dear Jane, what have you got to say in behalf of the interested people who have probably been concerned in the business? Do you clear them too, or shall we be obliged to think ill of somebody? Laugh as much as you choose, but you will not laugh me out of my opinion. My dearest Lizzie, do but consider in what a disgraceful light it places Mr. Darcy, to be treating his father's favourite in such a manner, one whom his father had promised to provide for. It is impossible. No man of common humanity, no man who had any value for his character, could be capable of it. Can his most intimate friends be so excessively deceived in him? Oh, no. I can much more easily believe Mr. Bingley's being imposed on than that Mr. Wickham should invent such a history of himself as he gave me last night. Names, facts, everything mentioned without ceremony. If it be not so, let Mr. Darcy contradict it. Besides, there is truth in his looks. It is difficult indeed, it is distressing. One does not know what to think. I beg your pardon, one knows exactly what to think. But Jane could think with certainty on only one point, that Mr. Bingley, if he had been imposed on, would have much to suffer when the affair became public. The two young ladies were summoned from the shrubbery where this conversation passed, by the arrival of some of the very persons of whom they had been speaking. Mr. Bingley and his sisters came to give their personal invitation for the long-expected ball at Netherfield, which was fixed for the following Tuesday. The two ladies were delighted to see their dear friend again, called it an age since they had met, and repeatedly asked what she had been doing with herself since their separation. To the rest of the family, they paid little attention, avoiding Mrs. Bennet as much as possible, saying not much to Elizabeth, and nothing at all to the others. They were soon gone again, rising from their seats with an activity which took their brother by surprise, and hurrying off as if eager to escape from Mrs. Bennet's civilities. So Mr. Bingley's sisters we're seeing again. They're pretty snobbish. They're only nice to Jane. So that's that. But there is going to be a ball at Netherfield at last. The prospect of the Netherfield ball was extremely agreeable to every female of the family. Mrs. Bennet chose to consider it as given in compliment to her eldest daughter, and was particularly flattered by receiving the invitation from Mr. Bingley himself instead of a ceremonious card. Jane pictured to herself a happy evening in the society of her two friends and the attentions of their brother, and Elizabeth thought with pleasure of dancing a great deal with Mr. Wickham, and of seeing a confirmation of everything in Mr. Darcy's look and behavior. The happiness anticipated by Catherine and Lydia depended less on any single event or any particular person, for though they each, like Elizabeth, meant to dance half the evening with Mr. Wickham, he was by no means the only partner who could satisfy them, and a ball was, at any rate, a ball, and even Mary could assure her family that she had no disinclination for it. "Well, I can have my mornings to myself," said she. "It is enough. I think it is no sacrifice to join occasionally in evening engagements. Society has claims on us all, and I profess myself one of those who consider intervals of recreation and amusement as desirable for everybody." So Mary again offers a very philosophical opinion. She says mornings are for me, my me time, but I will not be opposed to a ball. Elizabeth's spirits were so high on the occasion that, though she did not often speak unnecessarily to Mr. Collins, she could not help asking him whether he intended to accept Mr. Bingley's invitation, and if he did, whether he would think it proper to join in the evening's amusement. And she was rather surprised to find that he entertained no scruple whatever on that head, and was very far from dreading a rebuke, either from the Archbishop or Lady Catherine de Bourgh, by venturing to dance. "I am by no means of opinion, I assure you," said he, "that a ball of this kind, given by a young man of character to respectable people, can have any evil tendency, and I am so far from objecting to dancing myself that I shall hope to be honoured with the hands of all my fair cousins in the course of the evening, and I take this opportunity of soliciting yours, Miss Elizabeth, for the two first dances especially, a preference which I trust my cousin Jane will attribute to the right cause, and not to any disrespect for her." Elizabeth felt herself completely taken in. She had fully proposed being engaged by Wickham for those very dances, and to have Mr. Collins instead. Her liveliness had been never worse timed. So she asked Mr. Collins, "Oh, do you think it's appropriate for you to go to the ball? Are you going to come?" And then he asks her for the first two dances. Your asking to dance was a little more formal, Jane Austen's time, than it is today, so she pretty much has to accept him. It would be really rude if she were to refuse him. So she's kind of trapped, and now she has to dance the first two dances with Mr. Collins, when she would have much rather danced the first two dances with Wickham. There was no help for it, however. Mr. Wickham's happiness and her own was perforce delayed a little longer, and Mr. Collins' proposal accepted with as good a grace as she could. She was not the better pleased with his gallantry from the idea it suggested of something more. It now first struck her that she was selected from among her sisters as worthy of being the mistress of Hunsford Parsonage, and of assisting to form a quadrille table at Rosings, in the absence of more eligible visitors. The idea soon reached a conviction, and as she observed his increasing civilities toward herself, and heard his frequent attempt at a compliment on her wit and vivacity, and though more astonished than gratified by this effect of her charms, it was not long before her mother gave her to understand that the probability of their marriage was exceedingly agreeable to her. Elizabeth, however, did not choose to take the hint, being well aware that a serious dispute must be the consequence of any reply. Mr. Collins might never make the offer, and, till he did, it was useless to quarrel about him. So Elizabeth is now catching on that Mr. Collins is getting interested in her and actually marrying her. Mrs. Bennet is dropping not at all subtle hints, I don't even know if you'd call them hints, basically saying that she strongly approves of this marriage. Elizabeth just says, "He may never even ask me. I'm not even going to talk about this with my mom." If there had not been a Netherfield ball to prepare for and talk of, the younger Miss Bennets would have been in a pitiable state at this time. For from the day of the invitation to the day of the ball, there was such a succession of rain as prevented their walking to Meryton once. No aunt, no officers, no news could be sought after. The very shoe roses for Netherfield were got by proxy. Even Elizabeth might have found some trial of her patience in weather which totally suspended the improvement of her acquaintance with Mr. Wickham. And nothing less than a dance on Tuesday could have made such a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday endurable to Kitty and Lydia. And that is chapter 17.